I gave my family everything, until I found their secret while cutting me out for my deadbeat brother. Then a loan shark crashed in, threatening it all, and I teamed up with my siblings to break free. My name's Ethan, and I used to believe family was a bond you couldn't break. I grew up as the oldest of 3 kids in a house that always teetered on the edge of collapse. Peeling paint, creaky floors, a roof that leaked when the storms came. My parents scraped by, Dad with his patchy construction gigs, Mom with her late-night cleaning shifts, but it was never enough. From the time I could work, I stepped in. At 16, I flipped burgers to buy groceries. At 18, I handed over paychecks to keep the lights on. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt right. I was the one they leaned on, the one who held us together, or so I thought until a rainy afternoon a few months back turned everything upside down. I'd gone over to their place that day to help Mom clear out the attic. She'd been on me about it for weeks, complaining about the clutter, boxes of old clothes, tangled lights, forgotten toys from when we were kids. I didn't mind. It was a chance to be useful, to feel like I still mattered in a family that seemed to drift further apart every year. My sister Mia had moved to the city for a job, chasing a life I couldn't imagine, and my brother Tyler, the youngest, spent his days bouncing between friends' couches, avoiding anything that smelled like responsibility. I was the one who stayed, the one who showed up. The attic was a dusty mess, the air thick with mildew and memories. Mom stayed downstairs, her footsteps soft against the kitchen tiles as she puttered around. I was alone up there, sorting through the chaos, when I found it. A small metal box shoved under a stack of moth-eaten blankets. It was heavy, the lock rusted but loose enough to pry open with a tug. Inside, a stack of papers waited, and my stomach twisted the moment I saw them. Something about the way it was hidden told me I wasn't supposed to find it, but I couldn't stop myself. I pulled out the top sheet, and the words hit me like a punch. Last will and testament. My parents' names typed neatly across the top. My hands trembled as I unfolded it, my eyes scanning the lines for what I'd get, what we'd all share. But there was no we. Everything, the house, their savings, Dad's beat-up truck, was slated for Tyler. Just Tyler. Mia's name didn't appear, and mine was nowhere to be found. It was as if I'd been erased, wiped clean from their plans like I'd never existed. I flipped through the pages, my heart pounding, searching for some mistake, some explanation. But it was clear, signed 2 years ago, every detail locked in place. Tyler, the kid who'd never held a job, who'd borrowed cash from me and never paid it back, was their chosen one. I sat there, the papers crumpling in my grip, the attic beams groaning above me as rain tapped the roof. All those years I'd sacrificed came rushing back. Every late shift I'd worked to cover their bills. Every weekend I'd spent patching their walls instead of building my own life. I'd skipped college, lived in a cramped apartment, sent them money when I barely had enough for myself. And this was what I got. Nothing. Tyler, who couldn't be bothered to mow the lawn, was their future while I was a ghost in their story. Mom's footsteps creaked on the stairs, and I shoved the papers back into the box, my mind a tangle of hurt and rage. She poked her head up, her face soft with that familiar smile, asking if I was okay. I nodded, my throat too tight to speak, and hauled a few boxes down to keep her from suspecting. I made excuses about the weather, told her I'd finish another day, and left as fast as I could, the metal box tucked under my jacket. I didn't care if it was wrong to take it. I'd earned the right to know. That night, I spread the papers across my kitchen table, the dim light casting shadows over the words that cut me deepest. It wasn't just the will. There were bank statements, too, pages of red ink, missed payments, a mortgage balance that made my head spin. They were drowning in debt, and I'd had no idea. All those times I'd handed over cash, thinking I was keeping them steady, they'd been sinking further. And instead of telling me, they'd planned to hand it all to Tyler, like he'd magically fix what they'd broken. Sleep didn't come. I lay awake, the ceiling blurring as I replayed every moment I'd given them. Every dollar, every hour, every piece of myself. I thought I was their rock, their safety net. Turns out, I was just a tool they'd used until they didn't need me anymore. By morning, the hurt had hardened into something else, determination. I couldn't let it slide. I needed to know why they'd done this, why I didn't matter. I drove back the next day, the box heavy in my hands. Mom opened the door, her smile fading when she saw my face, sensing something was off. Dad was in the living room, his newspaper rustling as he looked up, his brow creasing. I didn't waste time. I dropped the box on the coffee table, the sound sharp in the quiet house. I pulled out the will, holding it up, my voice steady as I told them I'd found it, that I knew Tyler was getting everything. I asked why. Why, after all I'd done, they'd left me with nothing. Mom's hands shook, her eyes darting to Dad, who rubbed his temples like I'd given him a headache. They stumbled over their words, their excuses thin and brittle. They claimed it wasn't what I thought, that Tyler was young, that he needed the help more. I felt the anger rise as they painted me as the strong one, the one who'd be fine on his own, while Tyler, their baby, needed their support. They insisted it wasn't a punishment, just a choice, but it didn't land. Tyler wasn't helpless, he was careless, and they knew it. I'd been the one breaking my back, keeping their world from collapsing, and they'd rewarded him for doing nothing. I pressed harder, my voice cracking as I told them how it looked. Like they'd used me, taken everything I'd given, and tossed me aside. They didn't deny it, not really. Mom's tears came, her hands reaching for me, but I stepped back, too raw to let her close. Dad's face hardened, his excuses fading into silence. They couldn't explain why they'd hidden it, why they'd let me pour my life into them only to cut me out. That silence was louder than anything they could have said. It was guilt, plain and raw. I set the papers down, my hands steady now, and told them they'd made their choice. I told them I was making mine. I turned and walked out, the door clicking shut behind me as Mom's pleas faded into the rain. My chest ached, a mix of grief and fury, but something else stirred too, a resolve I hadn't felt before. I wasn't going back. They'd built their future without me, and now I'd build mine without them. But as I drove away, the weight of that box lingered, whispering that this wasn't the end. Not yet. Update 2. The quiet cracks and a sister returns. Leaving my parents' house that day felt like cutting a rope I'd been clinging to for years. The rain followed me home, streaking my windshield as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white against the gray blur outside. I'd told them I was done. No more money, no more fixes, no more playing the son who always showed up. It was a vow I meant to keep, but it didn't settle the storm inside me. I'd spent my life believing I was their anchor, and now I was adrift, the hurt too deep to name. I expected them to chase me. Texts, calls, anything to pull me back. But the silence that followed was louder than any plea. For days, I kept my phone muted, braced for the guilt trips I knew they could weave. Nothing came. Not a word. The quiet gnawed at me, tugging at old instincts to check on them, to make sure the bills I'd always paid weren't swallowing them whole. I pictured the house, dark, cold, the fridge empty, and pushed the image away. They'd chosen Tyler over me, written me out like I was nothing. If they were struggling now, it was their mess to unravel, not mine. Still, the emptiness lingered, a hollow ache I couldn't shake. Weeks slipped by, and I buried myself in work. Long hours at the warehouse, stacking boxes until my shoulders burned, taking every overtime shift I could grab. My apartment became a cave, the hum of the TV my only company as I tried to drown out the memories. I didn't tell anyone what had happened, not my coworkers, not the guys I used to grab beers with. It was too raw, too tangled. How do you explain that your own family saw you as a tool to discard? The metal box sat in my closet, a silent reminder of the truth I'd uncovered, but I couldn't bring myself to open it again. Then, one night, my phone buzzed, cutting through the drone of a basketball game I wasn't really watching. I glanced at it, expecting another bill or spam, but it was from Dad. The message was short, blunt. The gas bill was overdue, and they needed a spot. No greeting, no apology, just a hand reaching out like I was still their lifeline. My thumb hovered over the screen, a flicker of the old me itching to send the money, to fix it like always. But the anger flared hotter, burning that urge away. I typed a reply, sharp, telling them to ask Tyler, their chosen heir, and sent it before I could soften. The game flickered on, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying that moment I'd walked out. Minutes later, my phone lit up again. Mom this time, her call unanswered as it buzzed against the couch. The voicemail she left trembled with tears, her voice pleading for me to call back, insisting this wasn't who I was, that we were family. I deleted it, her words clawing at me even as I tried to shut them out. Family. That word had lost its weight, hollowed out by their choices. The next day, Dad's text came. Mortgage tight. A little help needed, and I let it sit, unanswered. Mom followed with another, claiming they were struggling, begging me not to turn my back. I ignored that too. The messages piled up over days, short, desperate, a rhythm of need I refused to dance to. I turned my phone off for a stretch, the silence a shield against their pull. It held for a while, until a call broke through on a Thursday afternoon as I clocked out at the warehouse. I almost ignored it, my hand hovering over the decline button, but the name stopped me. Mia? My sister, the one who'd escaped to the city, the one I hadn't spoken to in months beyond a quick birthday text. Curiosity won out, and I answered, leaning against my truck as the hum of forklifts faded behind me. Her voice came through sharp, laced with worry, asking what was happening with Mom and Dad. They'd reached out to her, she said, their panic spilling over. Claims I'd cut them off, that they were falling apart. She pressed for details, sensing their story didn't add up, and I let it all pour out. I told her about the attic, the metal box, the will that gave everything to Tyler and left us both out. I described the bank statements, the red ink bleeding across years of debt, how I'd been pouring money into a hole they'd hidden from me. I laid bare the confrontation, my hurt, their excuses about Tyler needing more, me being strong enough to stand alone, and how I'd walked away. She stayed quiet as I spoke, her breathing steady on the other end, taking it all in. When I finished, she exhaled, a sound heavy with disbelief. She hadn't known she was out too, she admitted, her voice tightening with the realization we'd both been erased. She couldn't fathom it. Tyler, the slacker, getting it all while I'd carried them for years. She questioned their logic, her frustration mirroring mine, and then resolved to come home. She insisted this wasn't right, that we needed to face it together, brushing off my half-hearted protest with a firmness I hadn't expected. She'd be here tomorrow, she declared, and the call ended, leaving me staring at my truck in the fading light. Mia's return caught me off guard. She'd always been the one who got away, building a life I envied but never chased. Now she was stepping back into this mess, and it stirred something in me. Relief, maybe, that I wasn't alone. The next day, she arrived at my apartment, her knock pulling me from a restless doze on the couch. She stood in the doorway, taller than I remembered, her dark hair pulled back, a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. Her eyes searched mine, seeing the exhaustion I couldn't hide, and she stepped inside without a word, dropping her bag and settling at my cluttered kitchen table. I pulled the metal box from the closet, setting it between us. She opened it, her fingers steady as she sifted through the papers, the will, the statements, the scribbled notes. Her brow furrowed as she read, her jaw tightening with every page. She lingered on the bank records, the overdue balances and mysterious transfers standing out like scars. She pointed out how bad it was. Mortgage payments missed, credit cards maxed, utilities on the brink, and I nodded, the weight of it sinking deeper. We both saw the pattern. They'd been in trouble for years, and my help had only delayed the inevitable. She pushed the papers aside, her gaze locking on mine, and I could feel her resolve hardening. She wanted to know if Tyler knew, if he was part of this, and I shrugged, doubting he'd care enough to be in on it. He'd always been the selfish one, drifting through life on charm and excuses. But she pressed, insisting we couldn't assume that we needed his side. I relented, pulling out my phone to call him, the line ringing as we sat there, the box between us like a ticking clock. Tyler answered, his voice thick with irritation. Caught mid-something, he didn't bother explaining. I told him Mia was here, that we needed to talk about the will, about him getting everything. His confusion came through, a stumble in his tone as he claimed ignorance, and I pushed harder, telling him to meet us at the diner in an hour. He grumbled, resistance clear, but agreed, the call cutting off with a huff. Mia watched me, her eyes narrowing as she weighed his reaction, wondering aloud if he was lying. I couldn't tell. He'd always been good at dodging, but I figured we'd see soon enough. An hour later, we sat in a diner booth, the smell of fries and coffee thick in the air. Tyler slouched in across from us, his hoodie rumpled, his hair a mess, his smirk fading as he took us in. I slid the will toward him, watching his face as he scanned it, his eyes widening with a shock that looked real. He tossed it down, his hands fidgeting, his surprise turning to annoyance as he realized he'd been kept in the dark too. Mia leaned forward, her posture tense, and I could feel the question burning in her. Why him? Why not us? Tyler slumped back, his arms crossing, his frustration spilling out in a way that matched ours. The air shifted then, a thread of unity weaving through the tension. Mia straightened, her resolve cutting through the haze, and I felt it too. We weren't done. We needed to face Mom and Dad again, together, to peel back the layers they'd buried. Tyler's reluctance hung there, but he didn't fight it, his foot tapping restlessly. As we left the diner, the night closing in, I knew this wasn't just about the will anymore. Something bigger waited, and we'd have to find it, together. Update 3. The confrontation that shattered the lies. The diner's fluorescent lights faded behind us as Mia, Tyler, and I stepped into the night, the air cool and heavy with the promise of rain. The decision to face Mom and Dad together settled over us like a storm cloud, thick with tension but laced with a strange, newfound strength. I'd walked away from them alone weeks ago, my hurt driving me out that door, but now my siblings stood with me. Mia's fierce determination, Tyler's reluctant resolve, and it changed everything. We weren't just chasing answers anymore. We were demanding them, united in a way we'd never been before. The drive to their house was a quiet one, Mia's rental car humming along streets I knew by heart. I sat in the passenger seat, my hands restless in my lap, while Tyler sprawled in the back, his foot tapping a nervous rhythm against the floor. The familiar sight of the house loomed ahead, its sagging porch, the chipped paint I'd patched too many times, and my stomach knotted. Dad's truck sat in the driveway, a silent witness to the years I'd poured into keeping it running. I felt the weight of that metal box in my mind, its secrets pulling us back here, and I knew this wouldn't be easy. Mia led the way, her stride purposeful as she approached the door, her knock sharp against the wood. Mom opened it, her face lighting up for a fleeting moment before it crumpled under the sight of all three of us. Her eyes darted between us, confusion giving way to dread, and she stepped back, letting us in without a fight. Dad was in the living room, his frame hunched in his recliner, the TV flickering with a news report he didn't seem to see. He straightened when we entered, his brow furrowing as the weight of our presence sank in. I set the metal box on the coffee table, its thud echoing in the stillness, and opened it, pulling out the will. My hands were steady as I held it up, my gaze locking on theirs, letting them feel the question I didn't need to voice. Why Tyler? Why not us? Mom's hands fluttered to her chest, her breath catching, while Dad rubbed his temples, his shoulders slumping under the pressure. They stumbled through their reasoning, their excuses spilling out in a rush. Tyler's youth, his need for guidance, my strength, Mia's independence. I felt the sting of it, the way they painted me as too solid to need them, Tyler as too fragile to stand alone, Mia as too far gone to matter. The air thickened as I pushed back, my voice rising in my head though I kept it silent here, letting my stance and the papers speak. I laid out the years I'd given them, every paycheck, every repair, every sacrifice, and how they'd repaid it with nothing. Tyler shifted beside me, his arms crossing tighter, his frustration bubbling up as he realized he'd been set up, not favored. Mia stood firm, her eyes narrowing, her presence a quiet storm beside me, amplifying the betrayal we all felt. Their excuses faltered, Mom's tears starting to fall, Dad's face hardening as they struggled to justify what they'd done. I pressed harder, dropping the will and pulling out the bank statements, spreading them across the table like evidence in a trial. The red ink glared up at us, missed payments, overdraft fees, a mortgage balance that dwarfed anything I'd imagined. I pointed to it, my anger flaring as I made them see I knew about the debt, the hole they'd been digging while I poured my life into filling it. Mom's sobs grew louder, her hands twisting in her lap, and Dad's gaze dropped, his fight draining away. They admitted it then, their shame spilling out, debt, years of it, piling up behind my back while I thought I was keeping them afloat. The room stilled as they unraveled the truth, their voices lost to me now, but their story clear in their faces. It wasn't just a little debt, it was a mountain, crushing them under mortgage payments they couldn't meet, credit cards they'd maxed out, utilities they'd let lapse. They'd hidden it from me, from all of us, letting me believe my help was enough when it was just a drop in a flooding bucket. And their plan, the will, Tyler's inheritance, was their desperate escape, a hope he'd sell the house, clear the slate, and let them start over. Tyler's hands clenched, his shock turning to outrage as he realized the burden they'd pinned on him, while Mia's jaw tightened, her disbelief mirroring mine. I stepped forward, my chest tight, letting them feel the weight of their betrayal. I'd given them everything: money, time, trust, and they'd used it, squandered it, while planning to leave me with nothing. Mom reached for me, her tear-streaked face pleading, but I pulled back, too raw to let her close. Dad's head bowed, his hands gripping the arms of his chair, and I saw the guilt there, the cracks in their excuses. They claimed they'd meant to protect us, to shield us from their shame, but it rang hollow. Protection didn't look like this. It didn't feel like erasure, like abandonment. Tyler kicked at the floor, his agitation spilling over, and I could sense his refusal to take this on, his rejection of their plan loud in his stance. Mia moved beside me, her presence steady, and I felt her resolve match mine. We weren't here to fix this for them, not anymore. I told them they'd made their mess, that I was done cleaning it up, my voice firm in my mind as I let my actions speak. Mom's sobs grew desperate, her pleas chasing us as we turned to leave, but I didn't look back. Dad stayed silent, his defeat carved into his slumped frame, and the house felt smaller, suffocating, as we stepped out. The night air hit us, cold and sharp, as we stood in the driveway. Mia turned to me, her eyes searching mine, her concern soft but unspoken. I shook my head, honest in my hurt, admitting I wasn't okay. Not yet, but I'd get there. Tyler scuffed the gravel with his shoe, his worry about what came next hanging between us, and I felt it too. The debt, the will, it wasn't the whole story. Those bank statements nagged at me, the initials I'd glimpsed, RJ, TM, hinting at something deeper, something they hadn't confessed. I pointed it out, my suspicion growing as I wondered aloud if they were tangled in more than they'd let on. Mia's brow furrowed, her mind catching the thread, and she agreed. We couldn't stop here. Tyler shifted, his reluctance clear, but he didn't pull away, tethered to us now whether he liked it or not. The realization settled in as we stood there, the porch light casting long shadows across the yard. Walking away hadn't ended it. It had only peeled back the first layer. Those papers held clues, names, transfers, a web of debt that stretched beyond the house. And I knew we had to dig further. I suggested we start with the copies I'd kept, my resolve hardening as Mia nodded, her determination mirroring mine. Tyler's foot stopped tapping, his resignation settling in, and I felt a flicker of something new. Unity, fragile but real. We climbed back into the car, the engine rumbling to life as we pulled away. The house shrank in the rear view, a relic of a life I'd outgrown, but the weight of what we'd uncovered clung to me. Mom and Dad's secrets weren't just about money. They were about trust, about who we were to them, and who we'd become to each other. As the town lights blurred past, I knew this wasn't over. The truth was still out there, buried in those papers, waiting to drag us deeper. And whatever it was, we'd face it, not as their pawns, but as a unit, ready to rewrite the story they'd tried to force on us. Update 4. Unraveling the web and facing the shadow. The night we left Mom and Dad's house clung to me like damp air, heavy with the weight of their confession and the unanswered questions that lingered. I woke the next morning with a restlessness I couldn't shake, the confrontation replaying in my mind. Their tearful excuses, the bank statements spread across the table, the way they'd crumbled under our united front. Mia, Tyler, and I had walked out together, a fragile bond forming in the wreckage, but the truth they'd spilled wasn't the whole story. Those initials, RJTM, scratched at me, hints of a deeper mess they'd buried. I couldn't let it go, not after everything they'd taken from me. Mia showed up at my apartment mid-morning, her eyes shadowed but steady, her duffel bag still unpacked like she'd decided to stay until this was done. Tyler trailed in behind her, his coffee cup clutched tight, his yawn stretching into a grumble as he flopped onto my couch. I didn't give him time to settle. I pulled the metal box from the closet and set it on the kitchen table, its contents spilling out as I opened it. The will stared back at us, but it was the bank statements I reached for, the pages of red ink and cryptic transfers that held the key to what they hadn't said. We sat around the table, the papers fanned out between us, and I traced the lines with my finger. Thousands moved to accounts marked RJ and TM. No explanations, just numbers that didn't add up. Mia's brow furrowed as she studied them, her mind already piecing things together, while Tyler leaned in, his usual slouch giving way to curiosity. I pointed out the pattern. $5,000 to RJ last year. 8 to Tia months later, more scattered across the pages. These weren't bank loans. They were personal, messy, and far too big for friends doing favors. The realization settled over us. This was more than debt. It was a web, and we needed to know who'd spun it. Mia pulled out her phone, her fingers quick as she searched, suggesting we start with names we knew. RJ sparked a memory. Roger Jennings, Dad's old fishing buddy, a gruff guy with a bait shop and a decent chunk of cash. I'd spent summers on his boat as a kid, his laughter booming over the lake. But now I wondered if he'd been more than a friend. TM was murkier. Mom's cousin Trish came to mind, but she was broke, no lender by any stretch. Tyler shrugged, his skepticism clear, but Mia pushed forward, insisting we check Roger first. I nodded, my gut twisting at the thought of dragging him into this, but I grabbed my phone anyway. The call connected fast, Roger's gravelly voice cutting through the line, warm at first until I steered it to the point. Had he loaned them money? His pause stretched too long, his tone shifting to caution as he asked why I cared. I kept it vague, mentioning the bank records, the initials, watching Mia and Tyler lean closer as the speaker crackled. He admitted it then, $15,000 over the years, small sums that grew bigger, promises of repayment that never came. My stomach sank as he explained, his regrets seeping through. He hadn't told me because it wasn't my burden, he'd said, figuring they'd sort it out. Mia's eyes widened, Tyler's hands clenched, and I pressed him. Were there others? Roger hesitated again, his sigh heavy, then dropped a name. Tony, a shady figure Dad had mentioned once, a guy from the bar on 5th. He'd warned Dad against it, called it a bad move, but didn't know the details. I knew the name. Tony Marone, a hulking man with tattoos and a cigar, a pawnbroker who dealt in more than trinkets. Everyone in town whispered about him, the kind of guy you didn't cross. I asked how much, my voice tight, and Roger couldn't say. Only that if Tony was in this, it was trouble. I thanked him, my mind racing as I ended the call, the pieces snapping into place. We sat there, the name hanging between us like smoke. Tyler's foot tapped faster, his shock spilling out, while Mia's face paled, her mind clearly spinning. Tony Marone wasn't a bank, he was a predator, and if they owed him, this wasn't just about money. I grabbed the statements again, my eyes locking on TM, $8,000 6 months back, 5 more later, no repayments listed. $13,000 to Tony, at least, and who knew how much more. The numbers blurred as I calculated, my anger rising. They'd been feeding him while I fed them, my help vanishing into his hands. Mia straightened, her resolve cutting through the haze, suggesting we needed more than guesses. Tyler slumped, his doubt clear, but I had an idea. Jake, a high school buddy who worked at the bank. He could pull their full records, see what else they'd hidden. I reached for my phone again, dialing fast, and Jake picked up, his voice bright until I laid out the request. I told him they were in trouble, debt, bad loans, secrets, and I needed everything he could find. He balked, his laughter fading as he weighed the risk, but I leaned on our history, my plea raw, and he relented, promising a day to dig. We spent the rest of that day poring over what we had, the table a mess of papers and coffee cups. Mia traced the timeline, small loans years back, growing as they spiraled, my contributions a thin thread holding it together until it snapped. Tyler fidgeted, his reluctance fading into focus, and I felt the shift. We were in this now, a team forged in betrayal. Night fell, exhaustion tugging at us, but we had a plan. Wait for Jake, then decide. I crashed on the couch, the box looming in my mind, its secrets whispering as I drifted off. Morning came too soon, Jake's call jolting me awake. His voice was tense, strained, as he laid out what he'd found. Loans from banks, credit unions, private lenders, a tangled mess of debt. But the real blow was Tony, $25,000 borrowed, no payments in months, a note about collateral that made my skin crawl. Then the kicker, a lien on the house, 2 weeks until it was gone, maybe less. Tony wasn't waiting, he warned, and I thanked him, my mind numb as I hung up. Mia and Tyler stirred, their eyes on me as I related. $40,000 to Tony when you added it up, the house slipping away, all hidden behind their excuses. The room spun as I stood, pacing the cramped kitchen, the truth crashing in. They'd borrowed from a shark, let it fester, and planned to dump it on Tyler while I bankrolled their delay. Mia's hands clenched, her shock turning to fury, while Tyler's face drained, his reality sinking in. They were losing everything, and we were caught in the fallout. I stopped, my resolve hardening. We had to go back, face them again, force the rest out. Mia agreed, her stance firm, and Tyler followed, his reluctance swallowed by the stakes. We grabbed our things, the papers stuffed into my jacket, and headed out, the air thick with purpose. But as I locked the door, my phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number slicing through the quiet. "Tell your folks time's up. Tony wants it now." My blood froze, the words searing into me as I showed it to Mia and Tyler. Their faces mirrored mine, fear, anger, determination. This wasn't just dead anymore. It was a threat, and it was here. Tony wasn't waiting for tomorrow. He was coming today, and we were out of time. I shoved the phone in my pocket, my hands shaking as we piled into the car. The drive loomed ahead, the house a ticking clock we couldn't outrun. Mia gripped the wheel, her knuckles white, while Tyler stared out the window, his foot still. I felt the weight of it. Years of trust shattered, a family unraveling, and now a shadow closing in. We weren't just digging for truth anymore. We were racing against it, and whatever waited at that house would change us forever. Update 5. The Reckoning and the Rebuild. The text from Tony. "Tell your folks time's up. Tony wants it now," burned in my pocket as we sped toward Mom and Dad's house. The car's engine a low growl beneath the storm brewing inside me. Mia's hands gripped the wheel, her focus razor-sharp, while Tyler sat rigid in the back, his usual slouch replaced by a tension that mirrored mine. We'd uncovered their secrets. The wolf favoring Tyler, the $40,000 owed to Tony Marone, the lien threatening to swallow the house. And now the clock had run out. I'd spent years believing I could save them, only to find they'd built a trap I'd nearly fallen into. But I wasn't alone anymore, and that gave me a strength I hadn't known I had. The house came into view, its familiar shape shadowed by dusk. Dad's truck parked beside a beat-up sedan I didn't recognize. My gut twisted. This wasn't just a visit. Something was already here. Mia pulled into the driveway, gravel crunching under the tires, and we stepped out, the air thick with the threat of rain and something darker. I led the way, my hand brushing the papers in my jacket, a silent vow that this time, we'd get it all. Mia's stride matched mine, Tyler trailing close, and I knocked, the sound sharp against the stillness. Mom opened the door, her face a mask of exhaustion that cracked when she saw us. 3 shadows from her past, united against her now. Her eyes widened, darting between us, and she stepped back, her hands trembling as we entered. Dad paced the living room, his shoulders hunched, stopping short when he caught sight of us. I pulled the papers from my jacket, setting them on the coffee table with a deliberate weight, letting them see I knew. Tony, the debt, the lien, the text that had yanked us here. Mom's breath hitched, Dad's face drained, and I stood tall, my presence demanding the truth they'd dodged too long. They crumbled fast, their defenses gone under our combined gaze. Mom sank onto the couch, her hands twisting, tears spilling as the story poured out. How it started small, $5,000 from Tony to cover a mortgage gap, a quick fix they'd thought they could handle. But his interest piled on, 10% a month turning into more, and they'd borrowed again, then again, until $40,000 loomed over them. Dad's head bowed, his hands gripping his knees, admitting they'd funneled my money to him, my help vanishing into his pocket while they sank deeper. They'd planned to give Tyler the house, hoping he'd sell it, clear the debt, and free them, a desperate dream they'd clung to even as it unraveled. I felt the heat rise in me, my fists clenching as I let them see the betrayal. Years of my life, my trust, swallowed by their lies. Tyler shifted beside me, his shock turning to anger, his stance rejecting the burden they'd pinned on him. Mia stood firm, her eyes blazing, her silence a mirror to my own fury at being erased, used, and left to pick up pieces we hadn't broken. They pleaded then, Mom's tears a flood, Dad's voice cracking with regret, claiming they'd meant to protect us, to shield us from their shame. But I stepped back, my distance a wall they couldn't breach, letting them feel the emptiness they'd left in me. A knock shattered the moment. Loud, heavy, rattling the door. My heart lurched, Mia's hand brushing my arm. Tyler tensing as Dad whispered Tony's name, his face ashen. I moved to the window, peering through the blinds. And there he was, Tony Marone, broad and menacing, cigar smoke curling around him, flanked by two guys whose hands hovered near their jackets. The sight chilled me, his smirk a promise of trouble, and I turned back, my mind racing. Mom's sobs grew frantic, Dad's hands shaking, and I knew we couldn't hide. They were out of time, and we were in the crosshairs. Mia's eyes met mine, her resolve sparking an idea. Call for help, fast. Tyler fumbled for his phone, his fingers quick as he dialed, his voice low as he relayed the threat to the operator. Intruders, danger, now. I moved toward Dad, my stance urging him to stall, and he nodded, unsteady as he shuffled to the door. He cracked it open, his frame blocking the gap, his voice trembling as he spun a lie. Half the money ready, a day needed. Tony's growl cut through, his patience gone, demanding it all, but I stayed by the window, watching as his guys shifted, restless. The knock came again, harder, Tony's bulk leaning in, his threat clear. He'd take it by force if he had to. My pulse hammered, the room closing in. But then, sirens, faint at first, growing louder, slicing through the dusk. Tony's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing, and I saw the flicker of doubt cross his face. He barked at Dad, accusing him of calling the law, but Dad stammered a denial, the sound lost as Tony stepped back, pointing a warning at the house. He and his guys bolted for the sedan, tires squealing as they peeled out, red and blue lights flashing around the corner just as they vanished. The cops rolled up, 2 cars for officers, their presence a lifeline we'd barely grasped. We spilled onto the porch, Tyler waving them over, still clutching his phone, while I pulled the papers and the text from my jacket, laying it all bare. Dad admitted the debt, the loans, Tony's threats, his voice breaking under the weight, while Mom clung to Mia, her tears soaking through. I showed the officers everything, bank records, the lien, the message, painting Tony as the predator he was, pressing the danger we'd faced. The lead officer, Harris, took it in, his pen scratching notes, his not a promise. They knew Tony, and this was fuel to their fire. They moved fast, filing the report, promising a restraining order, patrols to keep him at bay. Harris warned us, though, the debt needed settling, legally, or Tony would circle back. I agreed, my mind already turning, but I knew it wasn't my fight anymore. The cops left, their lights fading into the night, and we stood there, the adrenaline bleeding out, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Back inside, Mom and Dad sat broken, their regrets spilling over. Apologies, pleas, a love they swore was real. I faced them, my stance cold, letting them see the trust they'd shattered, the years they'd taken. Mom reached for me, her hand trembling, but I stepped back, my distance final. They'd lost me, and words couldn't bridge that gap. Mia moved beside me, her presence steady, suggesting help. Lawyers, counselors, a way out, but not from us. Tyler nodded, his foot scuffing the floor, his refusal to carry their mess clear. I agreed, my resolve firm. They'd dig themselves out, not lean on us anymore. We turned then, leaving them on that couch, the house shrinking behind us as we stepped into the night. Mia's eyes searched mine, her concern soft, and I admitted the truth. I wasn't okay. Not yet, but I'd get there. Tyler's worry lingered, his gaze on the road Tony had fled down, and I reassured him, the cops had him now, and he'd be smart to stay gone. The weeks that followed blurred together, a slow untangling of the chaos. Mom and Dad hired a lawyer with scraps of savings, started bankruptcy talks, put the house up for sale, enough to cover Tony and little else. Word came through Jake. Tony had skipped town, warrants piling up, his shadow fading under the law's glare. It wasn't justice, not fully, but it was breathing room. I stopped checking their calls, let Mia and Tyler handle what they chose, my focus shifting to us. Mia lingered in town, her city life on pause, and Tyler surprised me. He took a job at a garage, steady work that stuck. We started meeting up, pizza nights, quiet laughs, a bond growing where none had been. One evening, over greasy slices, Mia's smile broke through, her relief clear. We were better without their weight. Tyler grinned, his ease a rare sight. admitting we weren't so bad together. I felt it too, a warmth settling in, the first real peace I'd known in months. I'd lost the family I'd fought for, the one I'd built my life around, but I'd found something truer, Mia and Tyler, not as pawns or burdens, but as equals. I'd spent years chasing their love, only to see it was never mine to earn. Now, I was free, building something real with people who saw me, not just what I could give. As the night stretched on, laughter filling the space, I knew I'd made it through. Not whole, but stronger, and that was enough.